Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something a little different, the brutal reality of being drafted for World War II. Not the Hollywood version with heroic music and dramatic speeches, but the actual experience of having your entire life yonked away by a piece of government mail that started with greetings and ended with your childhood. So before we get into the trenches, literally take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you're into this kind of historical deep dive. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. It's wild seeing how this stuff resonates across different countries and time zones. Now settle in, maybe grab something warm to drink, because we're about to explore what it really meant when Uncle Sam decided your number was up. So, you think you would have handled the draft well? That you would have been one of the tough ones who marched off to war with a smile? Sweet summer child, like thinking you'd enjoy a root canal because you've seen it in a movie. Before you could even dream of liberating Europe or Ireland, hopping in the Pacific, you had to survive the draft. Uncle Sam's version of a surprise party. Except the only surprise was that your number came up, and the only party favor was a one-way ticket to basic training. One day you're working at the factory, flirting with Betty from accounting, planning your weekend at the picture show. The next day, there's a letter in your mailbox with the government's polite way of saying, "Congratulations, you've won an all-expenses, paid vacation to learn how to kill people." The letter was brief and to the point. Greetings, it began, which was the government's idea of being friendly before ruining your life. Report to your local draft board. Bring nothing but your optimism, which you'll need to surrender immediately upon arrival. The draft board. A collection of men who looked like they'd never smiled at anything more amusing than a tax audit, would determine whether you were fit for military service. This wasn't a request. This wasn't a suggestion. This was democracy in action, which meant you got to vote on absolutely nothing. Step 1. Present yourself for examination. Strip down to your underwear in a room full of other nervous young men, all trying to look either incredibly healthy or mysteriously ill, depending on their personal feelings about overseas travel. The doctor, who had the bedside manner of a livestock inspector, would poke, prod, and evaluate you like a prize bull at the county fair. Height, weight, eyesight, hearing, reflexes. Can you lift this? Can you see that? Can you follow simple instructions without having an existential crisis? If you could do basic human functions without immediately dying, you passed. Flat feet might save you, if you were lucky. Heart murmur could be your golden ticket home. Chronic asthma was better than winning the lottery. But if you were the picture of health, if you'd spent your youth playing baseball and eating your mother's cooking, if you had the misfortune of being a perfectly ordinary American boy in fighting shape, congratulations. You were exactly what they were looking for. The army needed bodies, and your body had just volunteered for service, whether you liked it or not. The psychological evaluation was equally thorough and equally pointless. Can you handle stress? Well, you're about to find out. Do you work well with others? You're going to be sleeping in a barracks with 40 other men for the foreseeable future, so you'd better learn fast. Are you afraid of loud noises? Too bad, because you're going to be surrounded by explosions, gunfire, and sergeants screaming at you from dawn until dusk. The military had a cure for every phobia: exposure therapy administered at maximum volume. Some tried to fail the examination on purpose. Suddenly everyone was discovering mysterious ailments, convenient disabilities, urgent family obligations. Men showed up claiming to be homosexual, which was grounds for rejection, though it required a level of acting that would have impressed Hollywood. Others tried the crazy act, pretending to be mentally unfit for service. The problem was, the doctors had seen every trick in the book. They knew the difference between genuine medical conditions and patriotic cowardice. If you were faking it, they'd spot you faster than a German sniper. If you made it through the medical examination, you were now property of the United States Armed Forces. Congratulations. You'd just been promoted from citizen to government asset. Your old life was officially over. Your new life would begin in approximately 6 weeks, which was how long it took to process your paperwork, notify your employer, and say goodbye to everyone you'd ever cared about. Use this time wisely, they said. Get your affairs in order, they said. What they meant was, prepare to become a completely different person. The day you reported for duty was the last day you'd make any decisions about your own life for the next several years. From the moment you stepped off the train at the induction center, every aspect of your existence would be managed by people who'd never met you and didn't particularly care about your personal preferences. Your schedule, your meals, your clothing, your sleep, your free time, all of it would be determined by men with clipboards and whistles who treated human beings like inventory. Boot camp was where they transformed ordinary American boys into soldiers, and the process was about as gentle as a sledgehammer to the skull. The philosophy was simple: tear you down completely, then build you back up as something useful to the war effort. Your drill instructor was a professional destroyer of egos, a man who could find fault with your breathing technique and make you feel ashamed of your own existence. He'd been doing this job since before you were born, and he was very, very good at it. Your first day began at an hour that didn't exist in civilian life. 4:30 in the morning, which was the military's way of saying that sleep was a luxury you no longer deserved. Revel was played by a boogler who had apparently lost all sense of human decency, followed immediately by the dulcet tones of your drill instructor explaining exactly how worthless you were and how much work it was going to take to make you into something resembling a soldier. Physical training started before breakfast because the army believed in earning your meals through suffering. Calisthenics, running, obstacle courses, more running, push-ups until your arms felt like overcooked pasta, sit-ups until your stomach muscles filed a formal complaint, and then more running, just to make sure you understood that running was going to be a major theme in your new life. The weak would be weeded out, the strong would be made stronger, and everyone would develop a permanent relationship with physical discomfort. Breakfast was served in a mess hall that had all the charm of a prison cafeteria, which was probably intentional. The food was prepared by cooks who had apparently learned their trade in some alternative universe where taste was considered a weakness. Powdered eggs that looked like they'd been mixed with sawdust, coffee that could strip paint, bread that doubled as building material, and meat of mysterious origin served in portions that were either too much or not enough, depending on whether you were trying to gain weight or lose your appetite. After breakfast came training, which was the military's word for controlled torture with educational value. Weapons training, where you learned to disassemble, clean, and reassemble your rifle faster than you could think. Close order drill, where you marched in formation until you moved like a robot and thought like a machine. Combat training, where you practiced killing people with bayonets, which was exactly as pleasant as it sounds. Map reading, first aid, communications, and dozens of other skills you never knew you'd need and hoped you'd never have to use. Your uniform was issued in sizes that ranged from too big to way too big, because the military believed that clothing should be functional rather than flattering. Everything was olive drab, which was the army's favorite color, because it showed dirt less than other colors and reminded everyone that fashion was no longer a priority in their lives. Your boots were heavy, uncomfortable, and built to last through conditions that would destroy ordinary footwear. Your helmet was designed to stop shrapnel, not to make you look attractive. Your gear was practical, durable, and completely indifferent to your personal comfort. The barracks were your new home, though calling it home was like calling prison a hotel. 60 men in a single building, sleeping on narrow bunks arranged with military precision, living out of footlockers that contained everything you owned in the world. Privacy was a concept from your previous life. Personal space was whatever you could defend with your elbows. Quiet was something that existed only in your memories. Someone was always snoring. Someone was always coughing. Someone was always getting up to use the latrine. And someone was always making noise that prevented everyone else from sleeping. Your bunkmates became your closest companions, whether you liked them or not. There was always the farm boy from Iowa, who'd never seen a building taller than a grain silo. The city kid from Brooklyn who'd never seen a cow. The college boy who thought he was smarter than everyone else, and the wise guy who had a joke for every situation and usually got everyone in trouble with his mouth. You'd learn to live with their habits, tolerate their personalities, and depend on them when things got difficult, because in the military, getting along wasn't optional, it was survival. Letters from home became more precious than gold. News from the outside world reminded you that somewhere beyond the barracks and training fields, normal life was continuing without you. Your girlfriend was still working at the diner, still going to the movies on Saturday nights, still living the life you used to live. Your parents were worried about you but proud of you, which didn't make separation any easier. Your friends were either already in the service or waiting for their own draft notices, and everyone was trying to pretend that everything was going to be fine when the war was over. The mail call was the highlight of every day, the moment when you might receive some connection to your previous existence. Getting a letter meant someone remembered you existed. Not getting a letter meant you were slowly disappearing from the world you used to know. Reading letters from home was like looking through a window into a life you might never get back to, and writing letters home was like sending messages in bottles, hoping they'd reach people who still cared about the person you used to be. Training intensified as the weeks passed. What started as basic physical conditioning evolved into specialized combat training. You learned to fire weapons you'd only seen in movies, handle explosives that could kill you if you made a mistake, and navigate terrain that seemed designed to break your ankles. You practiced amphibious landings in freezing water, night operations in complete darkness, and combat scenarios that were supposed to prepare you for situations no amount of training could really prepare you for. The drill instructors took special pleasure in simulating the chaos and confusion of actual combat. Smoke grenades, blank ammunition, shouted orders that contradicted previous orders, equipment failures, communication breakdowns, and general pandemonium that was meant to teach you to function when everything went wrong at once. You learned to think under pressure, make decisions with incomplete information, and keep moving when every instinct told you to find a hole and hide in it. Field exercises meant living outdoors in weather that ranged from unpleasant to actively hostile. Sleeping in foxholes you dug with your own hands. Eating rations that tasted like they'd been formulated by people who'd never actually eaten food. And staying alert during guard duty when exhaustion made you hallucinate threats that weren't there. You learned to appreciate simple things like dry clothes, hot coffee, and beds that weren't made of dirt and rocks. Medical training was everyone's favorite, because it meant you might be able to save someone's life instead of taking it, though the training was graphic enough to give you nightmares. Learning to treat gunshot wounds, sucking chest wounds, and traumatic amputations was not pleasant, but it was necessary. Everyone learned basic first aid because in combat, the medic might be busy, wounded, or dead, and knowing how to stop bleeding or treat shock could mean the difference between bringing your buddy home alive or in a box. Gas mask drills were particularly popular because they combined claustrophobia, chemical warfare, and the constant fear of suffocation into one enjoyable activity. You learned to put on your mask in seconds, clear it if it was compromised, and function normally while breathing through a filter that made everything smell like rubber and chemicals. The first time they made you enter a gas chamber wearing your mask, you understood that chemical weapons were not theoretical threats. They were real dangers that could kill you in minutes if you made a mistake. Weapons training went far beyond basic marksmanship. You learned to operate machine guns, mortars, bazookas, and other instruments of destruction that required teamwork, timing, and nerves of steel. Loading belts of ammunition, adjusting sights, calculating ranges, and coordinating fire with other units was complex work that had to be done perfectly under the worst possible conditions. Making a mistake with crew served weapons didn't just mean missing the target, it could mean killing your own men. Night training was especially challenging because everything was harder in the dark. Moving quietly, navigating without landmarks, communicating without making noise, and fighting an enemy you couldn't see required skills that didn't come naturally to most people. You learned to trust your other senses when your eyes were useless, to move by feel when you couldn't see where you were going, and to fight by sound when muzzle flashes were the only light available. The obstacle course was a daily reminder that the army was trying to kill you before the enemy got the chance. Rope climbing, wall scaling, barbed wire crawling, and other activities designed to test your strength, endurance, and willingness to continue when your body was screaming at you to quit. The course was timed, which meant you had to complete it quickly, and it was competitive, which meant someone was always watching to see if you'd fail in front of your peers. Bayonet training was the most disturbing part of combat preparation because it required you to practice the most intimate form of violence. Learning to thrust, parry, and strike with a blade attached to your rifle was training for face-to-face killing, the kind of combat that left no doubt about what you were doing to another human being. The targets were straw dummies, but everyone knew they represented real people, and practicing to kill with your hands, rather than at a distance, was psychologically difficult for most recruits. Leadership training was mandatory for everyone because in combat, leadership opportunities had a way of presenting themselves suddenly and without warning. You learned to give orders clearly, make decisions quickly, and take responsibility for the consequences of your choices. The army needed leaders at every level, from squad leaders to company commanders, and combat had a way of promoting people faster than peacetime ever could. Map and compass navigation was critical, because getting lost in combat was usually fatal. You learned to read topographic maps, use a compass, triangulate your position, and find your way in terrain that looked completely different from the maps you were using. GPS didn't exist, satellite navigation was science fiction. And if you couldn't figure out where you were using a map and compass, you were probably going to die lost and alone. Communications training covered everything from field telephones to radio procedures to signal flares. Staying in contact with your unit, calling for support, reporting enemy positions, and coordinating attacks all depended on communication equipment that was fragile, unreliable, and essential to survival. You learned backup procedures for when the radios failed, hand signals for when noise discipline was critical, and message codes for when the enemy might be listening. Vehicle maintenance was everyone's responsibility, because broken equipment in combat was a death sentence. You learned to perform basic maintenance on jeeps, trucks, tanks, and other vehicles that had to function in conditions that would destroy civilian equipment. Changing tires under fire, repairing engines with limited tools, and keeping equipment running with improvised parts was as important as knowing how to fight. The final phase of training was the most realistic and therefore the most dangerous. Live fire exercises with real ammunition, where making a mistake meant actually getting shot by your own side. Coordinated attacks with tanks, artillery, and air support, where communication failures could result in friendly fire casualties. Night operations with live explosives, where accidents could kill entire squads. Combat simulations used everything you'd learned in previous months, combining weapons training, tactics, communications, medical care, and leadership under conditions that were as close to actual combat as training could safely provide. You learned to function as part of a team, follow orders while taking initiative, and make life and death decisions under pressure that would have been unimaginable in civilian life. Physical conditioning never stopped, but it evolved from basic fitness to combat-specific endurance. Long-distance marches with full equipment, speed marches over difficult terrain, and endurance exercises that pushed your body beyond what you thought were your limits. The army needed soldiers who could fight at the end of a 20-mile march, function after days without sleep, and continue moving when their bodies wanted to quit. Psychological preparation was less formal, but equally important. You learned to control fear, function despite terror, and continue fighting when everything around you was chaos and death. Mental toughness couldn't be taught in a classroom. It had to be developed through experiences that tested your will to continue when continuation seemed impossible. The graduation ceremony was brief and anticlimactic. You'd survived basic training, which meant you were now a soldier instead of a civilian, though you didn't feel much different than you had 16 weeks earlier. You'd learned skills you hoped you'd never need, developed capabilities you'd never wanted, and prepared for experiences you couldn't really imagine. The ceremony marked the end of training and the beginning of the real war. Orders came with your graduation, and they were rarely what you expected or wanted. Some went to Europe, some to the Pacific, some to training assignments that kept them in the United States for months longer. The needs of the army determined your destination, not your preferences, not your family situation, not your personal desires. You went where they sent you. When they sent you, for as long as they needed you there. Shipping out was the final separation from your old life. The train to the port of embarkation. The transport ship that would carry you overseas. The last view of American soil you might ever see. Family members came to see you off if they could afford the travel. If they could get time off work. If they could bear to watch their sons and husbands disappear into a war that might not bring them back. The voyage overseas was miserable for everyone who wasn't a natural sailor. Seasickness, overcrowding, bad food, and the constant awareness that German submarines were hunting the convoy made the crossing an ordeal rather than an adventure. Sleeping in shifts, eating in shifts, and living in conditions that made the barracks seem luxurious by comparison. The crossing took weeks, and every day was a reminder that you were moving further from everything familiar and closer to something you'd only read about in newspapers. Arriving in Britain was your first real taste of a foreign country, and for most American soldiers, it was a shock. Different money, different food, different customs, different weather, and people who spoke English with accents that were sometimes difficult to understand. You were guests in someone else's country, representatives of America to people who were already fighting the war you were just joining. Additional training continued in Britain, because combat conditions in Europe were different from anything you could simulate in the United States. Different weapons, different enemies, different terrain, different weather, and different rules of engagement. The British had been fighting for years and had learned lessons that could keep you alive if you paid attention to them. Replacement training was necessary because combat units were constantly losing men to death, wounds, and psychological breakdown. You learned to integrate into existing units, work with men who'd already been in combat, and function in organizations that had developed their own ways of doing things. Being the new guy in a combat unit meant proving yourself to men who'd earned their positions through survival rather than training. Pre-invasion training was intensive, because everyone knew that the assault on Nazi-occupied Europe would be the largest and most dangerous military operation in history. Amphibious assault techniques, beach landing procedures, and urban combat skills were practiced until they became automatic responses. The invasion would be won or lost in the first few hours, and there would be no second chances if the landing failed. Equipment inspections became daily occurrence because faulty gear in combat was a death sentence. Your rifle, ammunition, radio, medical supplies, food, water, and personal equipment were checked and rechecked by officers who understood that equipment failures killed soldiers. Everything had to work perfectly when lives depended on it. Mail from home became less frequent as you moved closer to combat, but it remained vitally important to morale. Letters that took weeks to reach you carried news of a world that seemed increasingly distant and unreal. Girlfriends who were dating other men, parents who were aging without you, friends who'd moved on with their lives while you were preparing to risk yours for people you'd never met in countries you'd never seen. The final briefings before combat were detailed and sobering. Maps of the landing beaches, intelligence reports on enemy positions, casualty estimates that no one wanted to think about too carefully. You learned your specific objectives, your routes of advance, your rally points if the attack failed. The briefings were professional and thorough, but everyone understood that no plan survives contact with the enemy. The night before the invasion was sleepless for most men. Equipment checks, letter writing, quiet conversations, and private prayers were the common activities. Some men cleaned weapons that were already clean. Others wrote letters they might not live to mail. And everyone tried to prepare mentally for experiences that no amount of preparation could really prepare them for. Loading onto the landing craft was the point of no return. Seasick, overloaded with equipment, and crammed together in boats designed for cargo rather than comfort, you waited for hours in rough seas for the signal to begin the assault. Vomiting, praying, and checking equipment were the main activities, while you waited for the most important day of your life to begin. The approach to the beach was visible from miles away because of the naval bombardment that preceded the assault. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers fired thousands of shells at German positions, creating smoke, dust, and explosions that could be seen from the landing craft. The bombardment was supposed to destroy enemy resistance, but everyone knew that some Germans would survive to fight the invasion. Hitting the beach was chaos beyond anything training had prepared you for. Machine gun fire, artillery shells, obstacles designed to destroy landing craft, and Germans who'd been waiting months to kill invading Americans. Men died before they got out of the boats, others drowned in water too deep for their equipment loads, and the lucky ones made it to the beach, where the real fighting began. Combat was nothing like training, because the enemy was shooting back with real ammunition intended to kill you. The noise was overwhelming, the confusion was complete, and the fear was paralyzing for anyone who stopped to think about what was happening. You followed orders when you could hear them, improvised when you couldn't, and tried to stay alive while accomplishing missions that seemed impossible under the circumstances. The first casualties were shocking, even though you'd been prepared for them intellectually. Seeing men you'd trained with, lived with, and counted as friends suddenly dead or screaming with wounds that would cripple them for life was emotionally devastating. Combat medics worked under fire to save lives, but some wounds were beyond help, and some men died despite everyone's best efforts. Artillery fire was the most terrifying aspect of combat, because it could kill you without warning from miles away. The sound of incoming shells was unmistakable once you'd heard it, but by then it was usually too late to take cover. The explosions were deafening, the fragments were deadly, and the psychological impact was cumulative. Every barrage made the next one more terrifying. Machine gun fire required different tactics than anything you'd practiced, because the volume of fire was overwhelming, and the accuracy was lethal. Crossing open ground under machine gun fire was suicidal unless you had cover, suppression, or overwhelming numbers. Learning to move under fire, use cover effectively, and coordinate attacks with other soldiers was essential to survival. Sniper fire was personal in a way that other threats weren't, because it meant someone was specifically trying to kill you individually. German snipers were skilled, patient, and deadly, and they could kill you from distances that made retaliation impossible. Moving carelessly, exposing yourself unnecessarily, or becoming predictable in your routines could result in sudden death from an enemy you never saw. House fighting in French villages was particularly dangerous because every building could hide enemies, every window could conceal a sniper, and every room could be booby-trapped. Clearing buildings required teamwork, explosives, and nerves of steel, because you never knew what was waiting behind the next door. Tank warfare was terrifying for infantry, because tanks were nearly invulnerable to small arms fire, but could kill infantry with their main guns, machine guns, or simply by running them over. Learning to work with friendly tanks, hide from enemy tanks, and destroy tanks with hand-held weapons required training that no amount of peacetime exercise could provide. Air attacks were sudden, devastating, and completely beyond the control of ground troops. German fighter bombers could appear without warning, strafe columns of vehicles or troops in the open, and disappear before anti-aircraft fire could respond effectively. Learning to recognize aircraft, take cover quickly, and continue operations under air attack was essential to survival. Casualties mounted daily, and replacement troops arrived regularly to fill the gaps left by dead and wounded soldiers. The new men were enthusiastic, well-trained, and completely unprepared for the reality of combat. Teaching them to survive while continuing to fight was an additional burden on veterans, who were already stressed beyond their limits. Medical evacuation was a constant process, because wounded men had to be moved from the battlefield to aid stations to hospitals as quickly as possible. Corpsmen worked under fire to treat the wounded, stretcher bearers risked their lives to carry casualties to safety, and ambulance drivers navigated dangerous roads to get wounded men to medical facilities. Combat exhaustion was an epidemic that received little official recognition because the army needed every man it could get. Soldiers who couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't stop shaking, or couldn't function effectively were often classified as cowards rather than medical casualties. The psychological toll of combat was cumulative, and every man had a breaking point that was reached sooner or later. Rest periods were brief and rarely restful, because the enemy didn't observe regular hours. Guard duty, equipment maintenance, resupply operations, and preparation for the next attack continued around the clock. Sleep came in short periods between crises, and exhaustion became a permanent condition for most combat soldiers. Food was often cold, always monotonous, and sometimes non-existent when supply lines were disrupted. K rations, C rations, and whatever could be foraged from abandoned buildings became the standard diet. Hot meals were rare treats that reminded you of civilian life and peacetime pleasures that seemed increasingly distant and unreal. Weather was an enemy that couldn't be fought with weapons. Rain turned roads into mud, cold numbed fingers until rifles couldn't be operated effectively, and fog concealed enemy movements while hampering your own operations. Fighting in bad weather was miserable, dangerous, and unavoidable because wars don't stop for meteorological considerations. Equipment failures were constant problems because combat conditions destroyed equipment faster than it could be replaced. Weapons jammed, radios failed, vehicles broke down, and essential supplies ran out at critical moments. Learning to improvise, repair, and substitute became essential skills that weren't taught in training schools. German prisoners were reminders that the enemy consisted of ordinary men rather than monsters. Though some had committed atrocities that made compassion difficult, processing prisoners, gathering intelligence, and treating captured enemies according to international law required discipline and humanity under circumstances that didn't encourage either quality. Civilian refugees were heartbreaking reminders of what war cost the innocent. French families fleeing their homes, children separated from parents, elderly people too weak to travel, and everyone caught between armies that were fighting over their towns and farms. Helping civilians while continuing military operations required resources and time that were always in short supply. Liberation of concentration camps was the most horrifying and motivating experience of the war for soldiers who witnessed it. The systematic murder of millions of people by an organized government was beyond anything most Americans had imagined possible. Seeing the results of Nazi policies firsthand eliminated any doubts about why the war was necessary and what was at stake. Victory in Europe was celebrated briefly before attention turned to the Pacific War that was still raging. VE Day meant the end of fighting in Europe, but for many soldiers, it meant redeployment to the Pacific Theater, where the war against Japan was expected to continue for years. The celebration was muted by the knowledge that the fighting wasn't over. The atomic bomb ended the Pacific War before most European veterans could be redeployed to fight in Japan. The news was received with relief rather than celebration because it meant the war was finally over and surviving soldiers could go home. The moral implications of atomic weapons were less important than the fact that American soldiers wouldn't have to invade Japan. Demobilization was slower than anyone wanted but faster than anyone expected. Millions of men had to be processed out of the service, transported home, and reintegrated into civilian life. The point system determined who went home first based on length of service, time overseas, combat experience, and family situation. Going home was anticlimactic after years of looking forward to it. The train ride across the United States, the reunion with family members who'd changed during your absence, and the attempt to resume a life that no longer fit were more difficult than anticipated. You'd survived the war, but the person who'd left for the service years earlier no longer existed. Readjustment to civilian life was complicated by changes in yourself, your family, your community, and your country that had occurred during your absence. Jobs, relationships, and social situations that had seemed important before the war now seemed trivial compared to the life and death decisions you'd been making for years. Finding your place in a peacetime world required skills that the army hadn't taught you. The war was over, but its effects would last for the rest of your life. Nightmares, flashbacks, survivor guilt, and other psychological wounds were common among veterans, though they were rarely discussed and poorly understood by civilians. The men who'd served together understood each other in ways that their families never could, creating bonds that would last for decades. Looking back on the experience years later, most veterans agreed that military service had been the most important and formative experience of their lives. They'd learned skills, developed character, and formed friendships under conditions that tested everything they thought they knew about themselves. They'd served their country when it needed them most, and they'd earned the right to be proud of their service regardless of what it had cost them personally. The draft had taken ordinary American boys and turned them into soldiers, then brought them home as men who'd seen and done things that would stay with them forever. It had been involuntary, unpleasant, unnecessary, and it had defined a generation of Americans who'd answered their country's call when freedom and democracy were at stake. They'd done their duty, paid the price, and earned their place in history as the generation that saved the world. But the real cost wouldn't be fully understood for decades. The men who came home carried wounds that weren't visible, scars that didn't show up in medical examinations, and memories that would wake them up screaming for the rest of their lives. They'd learned to kill efficiently, survive under impossible conditions, and function despite terror that would have paralyzed civilians. These weren't skills that translated easily to peacetime employment or family life. The government had promised them everything would return to normal after the war, but normal was a concept that no longer applied to men who'd seen their friends die in foreign countries for causes that seemed increasingly abstract with each passing year. Normal was something that existed in the memories of 18-year-old boys who'd never heard artillery fire or smelled burning flesh or held dying friends in their arms while enemy snipers searched for targets. Employment was supposed to be guaranteed for returning veterans, but the jobs that were available often seemed meaningless to men who'd spent years making life and death decisions. Working in an office, following civilian supervisors who'd never been in combat, and caring about profit margins and production quotas required an adjustment that some veterans never successfully made. The skills they'd learned in the military, leadership under pressure, functioning without sleep, and staying calm in crisis situations, were valuable but not easily applied to civilian occupations. Education benefits through the GI Bill opened opportunities that had been unavailable before the war, but sitting in classrooms with students who'd never left their home states, listening to professors who'd spent the war in universities, and studying subjects that seemed irrelevant after what they'd experienced required patience that not all veterans possessed. Some thrived in academic environments that challenged them intellectually, others found college life frivolous and abandoned their education for more practical pursuits. Marriage and family life were complicated by the fact that veterans had changed in ways their wives and girlfriends couldn't understand. The boys who'd left for the service were not the men who returned, and relationships that had seemed solid before the war often couldn't survive the changes that military service had produced. Some marriages flourished because both partners were willing to rediscover each other. Others ended because the gulf between civilian and military experience proved unbridgeable. Children born to veteran fathers grew up with men who'd seen too much, experienced too much, and learned too much about human nature's capacity for both heroism and brutality. Some veterans became overprotective, others emotionally distant, and many struggled to connect with children who represented innocence they could no longer remember possessing. Fatherhood was another challenge that required skills the military hadn't taught and adjustments that took years to master. Social gatherings became difficult for veterans who'd learned to be constantly alert for danger, suspicious of strangers, and ready for violence at any moment. Parties, community events, and casual social interactions that had been enjoyable before the war now seemed artificial and meaningless. The conversations that civilians considered important, gossip about neighbors, complaints about minor inconveniences, and discussions of trivial problems, seemed absurd to men who'd witnessed genuine tragedy and real suffering. Alcohol became a problem for many veterans, who discovered that drinking could temporarily quiet the memories that haunted them, reduce the anxiety that never completely disappeared, and provide brief escape from psychological pain that had no other remedy. The government and society in general didn't recognize alcoholism as a service-connected disability, so veterans who self-medicated their psychological wounds were often blamed for weakness rather than treated for injuries. Physical disabilities were visible and received sympathy and support, but psychological wounds were invisible and poorly understood. Veterans who couldn't sleep, couldn't tolerate loud noises, couldn't handle crowds, or couldn't maintain emotional stability were often seen as weak or cowardly rather than injured. The concept of post-traumatic stress disorder wouldn't be recognized for decades, so veterans who suffered from what would later be understood as normal reactions to abnormal experiences were left to cope alone. Medical care for service-connected disabilities was available through the Veterans Administration, but the quality was often poor and the bureaucracy was overwhelming. Veterans who'd learned to function in military organizations that were efficient and goal-oriented found themselves dealing with civilian bureaucracies that seemed designed to frustrate and delay rather than help. Getting benefits, medical care, and other services often required patience and persistence that exhausted men who were already struggling with readjustment. Housing was a national crisis after the war as millions of veterans returned to civilian life and started families. The government had promised adequate housing for returning servicemen, but construction hadn't kept pace with demand, and veterans found themselves competing with civilians for housing that was expensive and scarce. Many lived with parents or in-laws for months or years after returning from overseas service, which complicated readjustment and strained family relationships. The economic boom that followed the war created opportunities for veterans who could adapt to peacetime conditions, but it also created pressures and expectations that were difficult for some to meet. American society expected veterans to be grateful for their service, successful in their civilian careers, and positive about their wartime experiences. Veterans who struggled with readjustment were seen as ungrateful or weak, and those who expressed ambivalence about their service were considered unpatriotic. Community support for veterans was strong in theory, but often inadequate in practice. Parades, speeches, and public recognition were common, but practical help with employment, housing, education, and medical care was often insufficient. Veterans learned that being thanked for their service didn't necessarily translate into concrete assistance with the problems they faced in readjusting to civilian life. Political involvement became important for many veterans who'd fought to preserve democracy and wanted to ensure that their sacrifices hadn't been wasted. Veterans' organizations became powerful political forces that advocated for benefits, memorials, and policies that reflected their experiences and needs. The generation that had fought the war remained politically active for decades, shaping American policy, both domestic and foreign, based on lessons they'd learned in military service. International perspectives were permanently changed for men who'd served overseas and seen how other people lived, fought, and died. Americans who'd never left their home states before military service returned with broader understanding of world affairs, foreign cultures, and international politics. This global perspective influenced American foreign policy for decades as veterans moved into positions of leadership in government, business, and society. Technology advancement had been accelerated by wartime research and development, and veterans returned to a world that was changing rapidly. Jet aircraft, nuclear weapons, television, computers, and other innovations that had been developed during the war were transforming civilian life. Veterans who'd worked with cutting-edge military technology often found opportunities in industries that were applying wartime innovations to peacetime uses. Industrial growth fueled by wartime production created employment opportunities for veterans who could adapt their military skills to civilian applications. Manufacturing, construction, transportation, and other industries that had expanded during the war continued to grow in peacetime, providing jobs for men who'd learned technical skills in the military. The disciplined work habits, leadership experience, and technical training that veterans had received often made them valuable employees. Suburban development was driven partly by veteran housing needs and partly by economic prosperity that the war had generated. The GI Bill provided home loans that enabled veterans to purchase houses in new suburban developments that were being built to accommodate growing families. Suburbanization changed American society profoundly, creating communities of veterans who shared similar experiences and values. Cultural changes reflected the experiences and values of the veteran generation. Movies, books, music, and other forms of entertainment began to reflect wartime experiences and the perspectives of men who'd served overseas. The generation that had fought the war began to tell their own stories. though often in sanitized versions that emphasized heroism and victory while minimizing trauma and moral complexity. Religious faith was strengthened for some veterans who'd found comfort in belief during combat, but weakened for others who'd seen too much death and suffering to maintain traditional religious beliefs. Many struggled with theological questions about divine justice, human suffering, and the meaning of sacrifice that their wartime experiences had raised. Churches and religious organizations tried to minister to veterans' spiritual needs, but many found that conventional religious answers didn't address the profound questions that combat had raised. Family relationships were complicated by the fact that veterans had experienced things their relatives couldn't understand and had changed in ways that were difficult to explain. Parents who'd worried about their sons during the war often found that the men who returned were strangers who bore little resemblance to the boys who'd left. Brothers who'd served in different units or different theaters often had vastly different experiences that made communication difficult even within families. Generational differences became pronounced as veterans tried to relate to younger Americans who hadn't shared their experiences. The gap between those who'd served and those who hadn't created tensions that lasted for decades. As veterans struggled to explain experiences that seemed increasingly distant and irrelevant to people who'd grown up in peacetime prosperity. Memory itself became problematic as veterans tried to process experiences that were too traumatic to remember clearly but too important to forget. Many found that their memories of combat were fragmented, confused, and unreliable, making it difficult to understand their own experiences or explain them to others. The mind's natural defense mechanisms against trauma often interfered with veterans' ability to integrate their wartime experiences into their peacetime identities. Legacy concerns became important as veterans aged and realized that their wartime experiences represented a unique historical moment that would die with them unless it was preserved and transmitted to future generations. Many began writing memoirs, participating in oral history projects, and sharing their stories with historians who were trying to document the war's impact on ordinary soldiers. The draft had been more than a military necessity. It had been a social transformation that had affected every aspect of American life. An entire generation of men had been taken from civilian pursuits, trained for war, exposed to experiences that changed them permanently, and then expected to readjust to peacetime life as if nothing had happened. The process had been traumatic, transformative, and ultimately successful in military terms, but its human costs would continue to unfold for decades after the last shot was fired and the last veteran came home.